Hey guys, John here, and welcome back to the Synthmaster tutorial course. Today we're going to be discussing the oscillator section, and specifically the basic oscillator. However, don't let that name fool you because the basic oscillator is capable of quite a lot. And let's start off like we always do with a fresh preset. So right click here at the top, go to Init Preset, and let's load up our saw wave. So let's first talk about the main controls located on the bottom left of the oscillator. The first one is going to be the volume. So here we can determine how loud this oscillator is going to be. And then we have panning to determine where exactly the oscillator is going to live inside the stereo field. Here's all the way to the left, and then all the way to the right. And then we can double click to go back to default. So next up, we have the pitch knob, which is going to determine the pitch of the oscillator. Now we can double click it back to default. However, we can also go into the right click menu and we can go select the default here. However, we also have some additional options. So we can enter a value by typing if we'd like to. We have our set pitch menu, which is really handy because here we have a range of -3 octaves and +3 octaves, and we can pick exactly how many semitones inside that octave that we want to set this to. So we can go down 1 octave and then maybe up 1, something like that. And then double click this back to default. We also have something very interesting as well, which is this quantized pitch, and we have a lot of different scales to pick from. So basically what this is doing, if we modulate this pitch knob with a certain modulator like an LFO or something like that, we can lock the pitch into a scale as the modulation moves. So let's kind of take a quick look and see how that works. So what we can do is if we right click our pitch knob, let's go to quantize pitch, and there's a lot of these to go through. However, let's check out the minor as we're all pretty familiar with this scale. And now we need to modulate this pitch knob. So we can go down here to the gear icon and go to add new, and let's go for an LFO. And we're going to cover all this a little bit later on in the course. And then we can click this here and maybe select a saw down, something like that. And then we can drag and drop this onto the pitch and maybe reduce the depth here just a little bit and bring down the speed of our LFO. And let's take a listen. So even though this is moving linearly, the snapping to the scale is really, really cool. So before we leave this here, let's go and check out another one here. Let's do maybe something like, let's go 7-tone and just pick something random like this. So yeah, definitely a really cool feature. Now, one thing I do want to point out before we leave the pitch knob is if we bring this all the way to the left here, we have a much larger range. We have down 5 octaves and down 4 semitones. And if we bring this all the way to the right here, we have +5 octaves and +3 semitones. So if you're going through the list here on the set pitch and you want a little bit more range, in this case, you might want to actually use the knob for something like that. So next up, we have the D2 knob, and here we can fine tune our oscillator by plus or minus 50 cents. And this comes in handy once we have multiple oscillators and we kind of just want to slightly detune them from each other. This is a perfect knob to go ahead and do that. So next up, we have the phase knob. Now this will determine the starting phase of our waveform, and we can see this update in real time. Now, in this specific situation, we're not going to hear a difference because we're just listening to one oscillator, but this can be useful for certain sounds where a sweet spot might occur between different phases of different waveforms, and you want those spots to be the exact same every single time that you play a note. It can also be useful for some bass patches to keep the phase consistent with the kick drum. Next up, we have a knob labeled high cut. Now, depending on what we have set on our algorithm here at the top of the oscillator, this knob will be labeled and behave differently. The same goes for the phase knob. So this high cut works on a spectrum basis and has a very steep filter curve. So let's compare this high cut steepness to the regular filter's steepness. And now the filter. And then high cut. So here with the high cut, we can almost hear it cutting individual harmonics. And we can see it's actually cutting individual harmonics here on the spectrum view as well. So while we're here, let's check out a few other algorithms. So where it says low pass, let's go ahead and select this here, and under spectrum, let's go check out the low shelf. Now it's important to look on the spectrum view to see what's actually happening with this signal. So this is interesting because the brighter is going to be louder, and we can see our filter sweeps, but we can also see signal in between that. Another really cool thing about spectral filtering, if we click this again here, go to spectrum, and this time we're going to check out the high pass, and let's bring our low cut all the way down for this example. Now let's say we have a signal and we want to remove just the fundamental. We can do that with the low cut. So right here it is gone. And we can bring it back. Or we can cut even deeper. And since I love the sound of sync, we also have a category for that as well. So let's go to the first one here and let's take a listen. There's a couple other options as well. Yeah, so I'd highly suggest to take some time and go through these lists and play with these knobs here. There's just so many tones that you can come up with here. Now, this knob, the vintage knob, is one of my all-time personal favorites in the synth, and it's implemented in quite a clever way. So what exactly is this thing doing? So the vintage knob is to help emulate analog synths by changing parameters such as fine-tuning, volume, panning, phase, and tone on a per voice basis. So what we can do is go here to the voices, and right now it's at 16, but let's scroll down to something like 8, for example, and let's right-click vintage, and let's go to edit voice modifiers. So here we have these parameters. We've got the fine tune, the volume, pan, phase, and tone. So for this example, let's check out panning. Now here, let's bring this all the way left, and then right, left, right, left, right, left, and then right again. So we have something like this, and we're affecting the panning. Now if we close this window and we bring the vintage knob all the way to the top, and let's start playing some notes. So you see how these different voices are triggering these different parameters as it's kind of going left and then right and then left again. So we can go back in here again, and we can go to edit voice modifiers, and we can change all these things depending on how many voices that we have, and it's just going to recycle this. Now, another cool thing as well, if we right click this here, we can go to randomize all voice modifiers and then go back to this menu, and we can see that all these things are just randomized. So it's kind of a quick way to randomize these different parameters and then dial in how much of those that we want, and then we can go ahead and start playing a patch, and we kind of get that randomness inside our sound. And another cool thing is that the vintage knob isn't restricted to the oscillator section. If you look here on the filter section, we can see one here, and then also here on the modulation section, bam, there's another vintage knob right here as well. So on the top of the oscillator, we have a button here called free. Now, when this is turned on, it puts the oscillator into free running mode. Now, this means that the oscillator's phase will be constantly moving, and whenever we hit a note, whatever value the oscillator's phase is at is what it's going to be. Now, when we just have one waveform going, this button won't make anything sound different. It's only when we add additional oscillators that we start to hear a change. Now this is useful because if we added another oscillator and it's playing the exact same waveform and the phase is starting at the exact same time, all we're really doing is just making this patch louder. So now let's take a look at Unison. So Unison is the process of adding additional voices to our signal, and on the top right of our oscillator, we see a section called voices, and currently we only have one voice. So when we click this, a menu pops up and it's asking us how many voices do we want this oscillator to have, and in Synthmaster 3, we can have a maximum of 16 voices per oscillator. So for now, let's go ahead and pick something like 7. So a very important thing to know before we even play a note is that if we add voices and this free button is off, that means that all the oscillator's phases are going to be in sync, resulting in the sound being very loud. So let's first turn on free, and let's just bring down the master just in case, and let's play some notes here. So now that we have additional voices, now is a great time to explore the Voices tab located on the right-hand side of the oscillator, where we're going to have a little bit more control over these individual voices. So the first knob that we see here is the mix knob. Now this will determine the volume mix of our original voice against the additional voices that we just added. And then next up, we have the pan spread, which is going to pan the additional voices across the stereo field. And next up, we have the detune spread. Now, this will detune the additional voices. And to the right of this, we have a detune curve, and by default, this is going to be a linear curve. So this curve will determine the behavior of how this knob functions. So let's take a listen and adjust the curve and see what happens. So let's go really, really tight to the right here. And we can kind of tell when it's set this way that the detune really starts happening almost in this general area. And we can bring it all the way to the left as well, the top left corner. And we can tell even with a low value here on the detune spread that the detune starts happening more immediately. And we get a much more detuned sound. So if we bring this all the way up like that, pretty detuned, and we bring this back to linear, not as detuned. So this is helpful if we really want to get a very detuned sound, then we go ahead and adjust this curve here. So this same concept also applies to the mix and the pan. So we can click this here and we can either adjust the mix or the pan and adjust the curves the same way that we did with the detune, or we can scroll with these arrows here. And always remember, if we have something like this and we want to go back to the default, we just double click this graph and it goes back to its default state. So next up, we have the phase spread knob. Now this is similar in concept to the other knobs, but here we're going to be dealing with the phase of the voices. Now to really hear what this is doing, we need to remove the detune spread, and let's also take this off free, and let's check this out. Our last spread option here is called the tone spread, and as the name suggests, this is dealing with the tone of the voices, which is based on the algorithm at the top of the oscillator. So let's take a listen and change a few algorithms. So underneath the mix knob, we can left click this here. It's going to bring up a list and we can select something called type. Now here we can have the Unison voices produce different chords, given that we provide enough voices to make that specific chord. We can also have the Unison voices spread across octaves or even as fifths. So before we demonstrate this, let's give a little bit of detune spread here and then turn free back on. Okay, so right now we're on Unison mode. Now if we click this here, we can go to fifth. Or we can go to the octaves menu and spread this across, let's say, 2 octaves. And even cooler, we can go down here to the chord section and say, let's play a major chord. Now I'm hitting one note here, but the voices are producing this chord for me. And there's some other options under this chords as well. So let's say maybe we can go to a minor seventh. Definitely pretty cool. To the right of the free button, we have sync. Now, this is the classic oscillator hard sync. It's when one oscillator's phase resets, it forces the other oscillator to also reset, which produces some very nice harmonic changes in the waveform. So let's go ahead and take a listen. So for this demonstration, we're going to change out this waveform to a classic saw down. So we have our basic shape down here. And let's go ahead and add another oscillator. So add new basic oscillator, and let's do the same thing here. So saw down. Now, right now we have 2 loud saw waves, right, as we can see that. However, if we enable sync here and then start changing the pitch, we can start to see how that changes the waveform and the sound as well. And there you go. So next up, we have oscillator drift. Now, this is a really cool feature because it helps us emulate analog synthesizers by letting the oscillators drift, and we have an amount knob of how much we want that to happen. So if we press a note here, we can see this is pretty locked in and this waveform doesn't really move. However, if we start increasing the amount knob, take a look here at the oscilloscope. It starts to slowly move. Now, if we really want to hear this, we kind of want to add a little bit more voices to our patch. So, for example, let's bring this all the way back down and let's play some octaves. And again, this is pretty frozen. And let's listen as we increase the amount knob. So sometimes just adding a little bit of oscillator drift can really make your patches sound a little bit more organic. We can also determine the speed of how this drift works. So by default, we're here all the way at the bottom. And if we hover our mouse over this, this is 0.1 hertz. However, we can make this a little bit faster all the way to a maximum of 10. So let's go back to the bottom and increase the speed and notice the change in sound. So to the right of the drift section, we have a key tracking section. Now by default, this amount knob is set to 1, and this setting makes our keyboard function like we would expect it to, by even semitones that ascend and descend as we ascend and descend on our keyboard. So here is a C major scale ascending and descending. However, if we were to bring this amount knob all the way to the left at -1, this will essentially invert the notes, meaning that as we ascend notes on our keyboard, the pitch will descend and vice versa. So here's ascending the C major scale and then descending the same C major scale. What we can also do is set this amount knob to 0. So let's right click this here and go to enter value by typing. Let's type in 0 and enter. Now every note that I play on my keyboard will be the same pitch. And we can see that here down on the keyboard as well. Now this is useful if you're maybe making percussive stuff or drums and you don't want the oscillator's pitch to change as you hit different keys on your keyboard. Now we have the bass note as well, so if we want to change what this bass note is, then this is going to be the knob for that. So maybe I want every note to be this pitch, or down here. This is where you want to go and dial that in. So a nice tip with this setting and also your homework for the end of this video, go ahead and create a patch and instead of having the amount knob on +1, do a very slight deviation from that and then add another oscillator and you're going to notice how you're going to get a little bit more of an analog feel. So that wraps up this video. In the next video, we're going to discuss the options within the oscillator's center display, such as making custom waveforms. So thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you learned something and we'll see you in the next one.